The call to the member for Barton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak to the Social Security Administration Amendment, continuation of Cashless Welfare Bill 2020, and I move the amendment circulated in my name, that all the words "that" be omitted with a view to substituting the following words: that the House declines to give this bill a second reading and notes that 13 years after the Howard government's so-called intervention into the Northern Territory, there is no evidence that compulsory, broad-based income management works. The Minister decided to make the cashless debit card trial permanent before reading the independent review by Adelaide University, and C, this proposal is racially discriminatory as approximately 68% of people impacted are First Nations Australians, and 2, calls on the government to not roll out the cashless debit card nationally and to invest in evidence-based policies, job creation and services, rather than ideological policies like the cashless debit card. Labor will not be supporting this bill. We will be opposing this bill. Yeah. And I am very disappointed to see the government has brought this bill forward to debate in NAIDOC week. It is absolutely insensitive, outrageous that the government would think that they're going to put this bill through this House in this week. Yeah. It's also, to me, something that screams of the lack of a partnership approach that the government so much lauds itself on when it comes to working with Indigenous people. It says to me very clearly that this policy and this government is not interested in evidence, and they will move without a clear evidence base in terms of policy development. And it's become to me crystal clear that the example of the Prime Minister's much-lauded changes to closing the gap, the promised partnership approach, is not being followed. And as I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill screams of hypocrisy, it screams of insensitiveness, it screams of racial discrimination, and it also screams absolutely that the government is not at all interested on evidence base. I can wear something if it's evidence-based and if it shows that it is truly working, but there is no evidence, and the government has put forward this bill before the Adelaide University evaluation has been read by the Minister, which I'll get to in a moment, or has been indeed made public. So I just cannot believe that the government's hypocrisy, that the government's lack of care, that the government's lack of respect is on full display of all weeks this week. This bill will make the cashless debit card permanent in the existing trial sites of Ceduna, East Kimberley, the Goldfields and Bundaberg Harvey Bay. But more than that, it will also permanently replace the Basics card with the cashless debit card in the whole of the Northern Territory. Shame. There has been no proper discussion, no proper consultation. The government talks about information sessions across the Territory. Well, big deal. I will evidence with those information sessions in my speech about what people in the Northern Territory told the government in relation to the rollout of this card. For people in the Northern Territory, they have long memories, and there are still the remnants of the intervention, the John Howard intervention into the Northern Territory. And this cashless debit card is just a continuation, in my view, and in the view of many people in the Northern Territory, an extension of that dreadful policy. And I know that the member for Lingiari will be highlighting that in his contribution to this debate. This bill will also replace the basics card with the cashless debit card in Cape York and extend income management in Cape York until the 31st of December 2021. It will make it easier for people to volunteer to be placed on the cashless debit card and allow a person to remain on the cashless debit card when they move outside one of the prescribed areas. Labor has long stated very clearly, very clearly, that if people want to be on the card, that is their right, and it is not up to Labor to stand in the way, but it has to be with full and informed consent. And I can assure you there has not been full and informed consent from any of these communities that I can see about what the government is intending to do in relation to this card. And the agenda is very clear. The agenda is very clear, and it is just a continuation, in my view, of the disdain that this government holds in relation to people that need to rely on social security payments. It will enable the Secretary to review and revoke cashless debit card exit provisions if the Secretary no longer believes the person who exited the card is reasonably and responsibly managing their affairs. And let me just say on that point, the only reason that that is there is because of Labor's amendments some time ago in the other place. There's no other reason that is there. And I suspect the government made a mistake in agreeing to those amendments at the time. Perhaps I'm wrong. But what we do know in relation to that is that the people who have applied to come off the card, there is an absolute go slow in the Minister's office about going through the administrative processes to give people permission to come off the card. This bill finally exposed the many, including our party, the Labor Party, have long suspected the government agenda to be. And this is very important. The government's true agenda, and this is the first or the second step, is a national rollout, a permanent rollout of the card right across the country. And for those National Party members who have seats where there is a lot of people relying on income support, they should be very worried about this legislation. And they should be looking at this legislation very carefully. The cashless debit card was first proposed as a trial, but we now know the government has never been interested in finding out whether in fact it works. We hear the government often talk about how it's reducing this and reducing that. I have no idea how the government can actually say that, because there is no proper evidence in existence publicly available to back in those assertions. And as I said, Labor is not in the business of standing between individuals and communities that want to voluntarily adopt this card. We've been very clear about that. But this is not voluntary, and it is certainly not with people's consent. In Senate estimates, the Minister admitted that she'd not read the long-awaited review from Adelaide University before deciding to make the cashless debit card trials permanent. And we still don't know, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether the Minister has read the evaluation, and we still don't know whether or not the evaluation is going to be made public. But it really is a moot point. I mean, $2.5 million this government spent on this evaluation that may as well have been tabled and sit on a dusty shelf in terms of providing the advice and the evidence for what should happen now and into the future with the cashless debit card. Don't worry about the evaluation. We'll just introduce these permanent arrangements anyhow. On October the 6th, the government announced their intention to make the cashless debit card trials permanent in the budget. On October the 8th, the government introduced this legislation to make the trials permanent. But on October the 29th, when the Labor Senator for the Northern Territory, Malarndirri McCarthy, revealed, asking Senator Ruston, "Minister, have you read the Adelaide report?" And the minister replied, "No." This would have been many weeks after the minister and the government decided to make the cashless debit card trials permanent. So you tell me where the evidence base is. You tell me where the evidence base is. There is none. There is none. And it is proof positive that the government had no intention at all of taking into account, as I said, that $2.5 million study done by the University of Adelaide. The government not only did which the government only did in the first place when under pressure from the crossbench as part of one of their previous extensions of the cashless debit card trial. So had not been pressure from the crossbench, there'd be no evaluation anyway, anyhow. This comes after the Auditor-General found that there was no evidence. The Auditor-General, mind you, found there was no evidence, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the card works to reduce social harm as claimed by the government. Now, that's not Labor saying this. This is the Auditor-General saying this. Hardly influenced, never influenced, of course. So what we have is an Adelaide University evaluation that the minister admitted she hadn't read, despite having introduced this permanency in the budget that the Treasurer brought down. We have that situation. We now have the Adelaide University evaluation, which may well not have been done, and has only been done because the crossbench said to the minister, "We want some evidence." But big deal. Didn't really matter what Adelaide University has said to where the government's intentions are. The simple reality of this bill that it is racially discriminatory. I'll say that again. The simple reality of this bill is it is racially discriminatory. The rollout of the cashless debit card, as proposed by the government, will disproportionately impact First Nations people. And I know that other speakers in this debate will refer to that. 68% of people who will be forced onto the cashless debit card are First Nations people. Over 23,000 out of the 34,000 people impacted by this card will be First Nations people. Now, if that's not racially discriminatory, tell me what is. And as the member for Lingiari will expand on, 18,000 of that 23,000 people live in one part of this country called the Northern Territory. Labor is not opposed to income management in all circumstances, and we've been clear about that. There are circumstances such as child protection, issues of domestic violence and dysfunction, where income management is appropriate. There's no argument about that. But where the argument is broad-based compulsory programs that catch and disempower the wrong people. I went to Bundaberg, Hervey Bay, and I heard from several non-Aboriginal young women, single mums, that had been put onto the card without their consent, who are finding it so disempowering, so embarrassing, and their discussions with me left a powerful impact. Income management can be justified when targeted, as I said, in some circumstances, but indiscriminate, broad-based income management simply does not work. At a recent inquiry into another one of the government's cashless debit card bills, a number of witnesses told their hearing that one of the only credible pieces of evaluation of any form of income management is the evaluation that was completed about income management in the Northern Territory. And that report found that compulsory income management usually does not bring about improvements, but voluntary income management might. But it is not just the evaluation that says this. In a document presented to the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Australian government wrote, "There are more positive results associated with people who volunteer." This is the Australian government. "As they have made a choice to change their behaviour and receive assistance. Positive findings have been found for people who have been referred for income management by a social worker or a child protection officer." So on one hand, you've got the government saying something to the UN, but doing something very different in this chamber that is going to impact thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. I reiterate that the Australian government wrote this to the UN. Dr Elise Klein of the University of Melbourne told a Senate committee that, about this issue that, and I quote, "If we are serious about evidence-based policy making, we must stop the ongoing operations of the cashless debit card or make it entirely voluntary." There is a very real difference between someone who genuinely wants to be on the card and believes it's appropriate for their own circumstances, and someone who is compelled to go onto the card and whose circumstances are completely incompatible with the card. When I visited the East Kimberley, I saw this absolutely. There was a woman, a middle-aged First Nations woman, who had a public service job in Perth. She went back to East Kimberley, to Broome, to care for her mother and went on to a carer payment and then had to go onto the cashless debit card, despite the fact that she has spent a good part of her career, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a public servant. I mean, tell me how that's reasonable. Tell me how that's fair. The Aboriginal peak organisations of the Northern Territory, which includes Central Northern Land Council, the Aboriginal Medical Service Alliance in the NT, said in one of their submissions on the card that this continuation of compulsory income management through the transfer to the CDC is being rushed forward despite the lack of any strong positive evidence drawn from either the 2014 Social Policy Research Centre evaluation on new income management in the NT or the 2017 ARIMA research evaluation of the cashless debit card trials in Ceduna, the Goldfields and East Kimberley. Income management cannot provide a transition to employment in locations where few employment opportunities exist, and those that exist are largely done by outsiders. Instead, for many Aboriginal residents of the NT, particularly those living remotely, compulsory income management is a long-term, and regardless of a person's lifestyle, financial management capacity, it's almost impossible to get off. The 2014 independent evaluation of the new income management conducted by the Social Policy Research Centre found that 90.2% of those on income management in the NT were Indigenous people. 76 of those were on compulsory income management, and more than 60% of this group were on income management for more than 6 years. The Arnhem Land Progress Association, a Progress Aboriginal Corporation, said that the Alpha Board of Directors are disappointed that the government is moving forward and expanding this oppressive policy when there is no evidence demonstrating that it creates positive change in people who will be subjected to it. There is no evidence that this leads to employment. And for the rhetoric of the government, which is about employment, we're about creating jobs, in the face of that, they introduce this very bill that makes it almost impossible to actually get a job. Tell me how that works. Tell me, because I would like to know. The Anti-Poverty Network of South Australia also told the story about a woman they had met in Ceduna who was on the card. She volunteered at her local craft shop and donated what she could. She used to be able to purchase things online, but because of the card, can no longer do so. The network told the committee about this particular person, never drunk, never had drugs or anything like that. It's such an inhibitive way of life for her now. Why should anyone that has never engaged in binge drinking or taken illicit drugs be forced onto the card? And yet that was the rationale for the card. It's just mind-boggling that the government thinks that this is a good idea. It seems to me that the government is not interested in answers. This bill is just the beginning of the government's plan for the cashless debit card, as I said earlier, Madam Deputy Speaker. We know that there are those on the other side who have publicly called for the national rollout. And we also know from Senate estimates that the government has established a technology working group with the big banks. Now that tells us something. That tells us something about the government's plan. The supermarkets and Australia Post look at how this can be rolled out through the payment system. So the 4 big banks have set up groups to roll this out. Australia Post has, and so have the supermarkets. That is evidence writ large of what the intentions are. And we also know that this is what you do if you want a national rollout. You put technology working groups into those institutions. You work out how every card from every bank can have restrictions placed on it. Now, that's not about choice. That's not about individual responsibility. It's just not. It is not the way you do business and stay true to what you are publicly saying. You work out how every card, as I said, from every bank can have restrictions placed on it. So the government can track and control what people on social security do with their money in pretty much every shop around the country. It's actually scary. It's actually scary that the government thinks it's a good idea to do this. It's not about empowering. It's not about jobs. It's not about giving people responsibility and supporting them to manage and grow that responsibility. It's not about enjoying personal decisions. It's about control. It is absolutely about control. So the government can track and control, as I said. We already know that, and I note my colleague who has responsibility for this area has just taken over the chair. We already know that people on a disability support pension are on the cashless debit card. It is only a matter of time before more people are caught up in this new so-called system. In fact, pensioner groups are already worried about what this card could mean for them. Now, we are talking about millions of people having restrictions placed on them and control placed on them, and their spending being tracked and controlled. In their submission on this bill, the Combined Pensioners and Superannuants Association says members have contacted them about how very fearful they are of being put compulsorily onto this card. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, noting that there are amendments in my name circulated, Labor will not be supporting this bill. It represents a cynical triumph of ideology over evidence, and the government's plans for a much bigger, broader rollout of social security quarantining have been laid bare in black and white. It is an insult that this has been shoved into this chamber during NAIDOC week, because it's backward, it's racially discriminatory, it continues the scraps of the last vestiges of the dismal failure of what was the Howard government's so-called intervention into the Northern Territory. The processes the government has taken in making this policy is a slap in the face to the coalition of peak Aboriginal organisation. It makes a mockery of the government's new Closing the Gap partnership, an absolute mockery. It doesn't create jobs, it doesn't deliver clean water, it doesn't improve dilapidated remote housing, and it doesn't help close the gap. So I simply don't know why the government is doing this. I truly don't. Except, Madam Deputy Speaker, except to blame and punish some of the most disenfranchised people in this nation.
I thank the member. Is the amendment seconded? And then
my right to speak.
I thank the member. So